Who are they? 40 people now living their final days in the special unit at San Quentin. Some wiped out an entire family in a single night. Some left behind a lingering fear for an entire city. Why did they do it? What drove them to that irreversible limit? Join me as we walk through the list of 40 names that even the justice system treads carefully around. First, Isauro Aguirre. When Gabriel Fernandez was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, the nurses could not believe what they saw. The body of the 8-year-old boy was covered in layers of old and new wounds. For 8 months, Isauro Aguirre, Gabriel's mother's boyfriend, turned their apartment in Palmdale into a house of torment. No whips, only bats, irons, BB guns, and countless lies. Gabriel died in silence, and America fell silent with him. Aguirre was arrested shortly after. Social workers, classmates, and doctors all confirmed the scale of the abuse was beyond imagination. In 2018, the court in Los Angeles sentenced him to death for murder with aggravated torture. He is now held at Corcoran, amid a wave of outrage that has never subsided, where the name Gabriel has become a symbol of the cruel silence of adults. Second, Marcus Delon Wesson. On March 12, 2004, Fresno police received a frantic call from 2 young women. They said their father was holding the entire family hostage. When officers arrived at the small home, they never expected what was inside. 9 bodies stacked together. Each had been shot once. Marcus Wesson, a man who looked like a preacher, stepped out with blood still on his shirt. The investigation revealed something horrific. He was both the father and the grandfather of the victims. For years, Wesson manipulated his family like his own cult, forced incestuous marriages, preached about Jesus the vampire. Though he always denied pulling the trigger, the court still sentenced him to death. Today, Wesson lives in San Quentin, the final stop for a man who turned family into the deadliest weapon. Third, Alejandro Avila. Little Samantha Runyon, 5 years old, was playing in her yard when a stranger approached. He said he needed help finding his lost dog. Just hours later, Samantha's body was found, abandoned on a hillside. Her small body bore marks of cruelty too horrible to name. Alejandro Avila, previously investigated in another abuse case, was arrested after witnesses confirmed his car matched footage from nearby cameras. At trial, the prosecutor said, "He did not just kill a child, he robbed an entire community of its trust." In 2005, Avila was sentenced to death. He is now at San Quentin, where every night serves as a reminder. Some crimes can never be forgiven. Fourth, Richard Allen Davis. One October night in Petaluma, 12-year-old Polly Klaas was at home with friends when a man broke in, armed with a knife. He covered Polly's mouth, took her away, and vanished into the darkness. More than 2 months later, during an unrelated arrest, Richard Allen Davis confessed. He led police to where he had buried her, deep in the woods, just a few miles from where she was taken. The entire nation was shaken. Polly's image became a symbol. Her case led California to pass the 3 strikes law. In 1996, Davis was sentenced to death. On the day of his sentencing, he mocked the victim's parents. The courtroom erupted in anger. He remains at San Quentin, not just as an inmate, but as a grim reminder to America. Sometimes, evil comes from the most ordinary faces. Fifth, Charles Chi-tat. A cabin deep in the Calaveras woods. Footage from a hidden camera. Women trapped in a basement, begging in desperation. Charles Ng, alongside Leonard Lake, recorded everything like an experiment. From 1983 to 1985, they lured couples, families, and lone women to their so-called survivalist paradise. Then turned them into prey. When Lake was arrested and took his own life, Ng fled to Canada. After years of extradition battles, he faced trial in California. It became the most expensive court case in state history at the time. In 1999, Ng was sentenced to death. His face cold as stone, his eyes devoid of feeling. In Lake's diary, one line was written, "We create the world the way we want it." Ng was the living embodiment of that belief. warped and void of humanity. 6th, Cary Stayner, Yosemite, where nature's beauty meets serenity. But in the summer of 1999, this place was haunted by a man hiding among the tourists. Cary Stayner, a maintenance worker at a motel, approached visitors with a friendly face, then turned into a predator. 3 women, including a 15-year-old girl, were killed. Their bodies left in the wilderness. Weeks later, he murdered another woman near Mariposa. When arrested, Stayner confessed everything without hesitation. He said, "I was tired of holding back." Ironically, his brother, Stephen Stayner, had once been a symbol of survival after a kidnapping. But Cary became the opposite, a symbol of cold-blooded evil. He was sentenced to death. And now, inside his cell at San Quentin, he still paints landscapes, in a place where nature is no longer peaceful. 7th, Luis Bracamontes. 2 officers were shot dead in broad daylight, one at a Walmart parking lot, the other hunted down on the Sacramento freeway. The man behind these deaths was Luis Bracamontes, an illegal immigrant with a federal criminal record, yet still in possession of a rifle. When arrested, he showed no remorse. In court, he even laughed and declared, "I wish I could have killed more." This case became a symbol in America's debate over immigration and gun control. In 2018, he was sentenced to death after a trial that shocked the nation. He is now held at San Quentin, awaiting execution. But for many, no legal sentence can compare to the sentence of public opinion, where every word he speaks feels like a fresh wound to those who wear the uniform. 8th, Vincent Edward Brothers. When police entered the home in Bakersfield, they could not believe their eyes. 5 bodies, his wife, 3 young children, and mother-in-law, lay scattered across the rooms. There was no sign of forced entry, and Vincent, a school principal, had just returned from a work trip in Ohio. But his journey was exposed through rental car data, showing he had traveled thousands of miles just to commit the crime and return as if nothing had happened. In 2007, he was sentenced to death. Not just for the crime itself, but for the way he planned it. Methodical, cold, and calculated. Brothers is now held at San Quentin, carrying the label, "The Man Who Took the Lives of His Own Flesh and Blood." 9th, Randy Stephen Kraft. A highway, a car, a man asleep, beside the body of his victim. California officers pulled over the car in 1983 and uncovered what they called a scorecard of death. 61 cryptic entries, matching unsolved killings spanning over a decade. Randy Kraft, who appeared mild-mannered, was charged with taking the lives of at least 16 young men, many of them soldiers, truck drivers, or drifters. The victims were often drugged, restrained, tortured, and then discarded along highways. Kraft was sentenced to death in 1989. To this day, he has remained silent about the other names on the list, numbers no one truly understands except him. 10th, Tiequon Aundray Cox. One August morning, 4 bodies were found inside a small home in Los Angeles. The mother, sister-in-law, and 2 young nephews of former NFL player Kermit Alexander. They were shot right in the living room. No warning. No chance to beg for their lives. Tiequon Cox, 18, a member of the Rollin 60 Crips gang, was identified as the mastermind. He had attacked the wrong house in a mistaken act of revenge. Police found matching ballistic evidence and witness statements. In 1986, Cox was sentenced to death, becoming one of the youngest inmates ever on death row at the time. Today, he remains at San Quentin, behind thick walls where time seems frozen since the night the Alexander family lost everything. 11th, Wayne Adam Ford. In October 1998, Wayne Ford walked into a police station carrying a bag. Inside was a body part of an unidentified woman. "I need to confess," he said, and began recounting 4 killings. All women, all picked up during his long-haul drives. He did not hide it. He did not show mercy. He simply explained, coldly and in detail. Investigations confirmed that from 1997 to 1998, Ford took the lives of at least 4 women, all with his bare hands. their bodies abandoned across multiple states. In 2006, he was sentenced to death. He did not protest, he simply stayed silent. At San Quentin, Wayne Ford is still known as the killer who turned himself in, a nickname carrying both horror and an oddity in a world where killers usually run. 12th, Maria del Rosio, Rosie Alfaro. That day, the home in Anaheim was quiet. Autumn Wallace, 9 years old, was home alone, a book still open to page 3. The door opened and Rosie Alfaro stepped inside. She was not a stranger. She had once been friends with Autumn's older sister, but that day Rosie did not come to visit. With a knife in hand, she acted swiftly, leaving behind no life at the scene. Rosie was just 18 when she committed the crime. She later claimed she only intended to steal, but her actions went far beyond that. She was arrested shortly after. In court, in 1992, Rosie became the first woman sentenced to death in Orange County. She is now held at the Central California Women's Facility, carrying the sentence she calls the price of a moment when evil took control. 13th, Chester Dewayne Turner. Los Angeles in the 1980s. A city glowing by day but turning into a nightmare for women living on the margins after dark. For 11 years, at least 14 women went missing. Their bodies were found weeks later, and no one knew who was responsible. Not until 2003, when DNA from an old assault case linked them all to one man. Chester Turner. A pizza delivery worker, he quietly moved around the city. He did not choose victims at random. He targeted those overlooked, those no one would search for. In court, he denied all charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2007, Turner was sentenced to death, and later he received 4 additional murder convictions. In police files, detectives called him the invisible shadow haunting the city. 14th, Marcus Dorwin Adams. One afternoon in September in South Los Angeles, neighbors heard multiple gunshots coming from a parked car. When police arrived, 3 men lay slumped in their seats, each shot dead. The shooter was Marcus Dorwin Adams, only 24 at the time. He did not run, he left no explanation. Nearly a month later, Adams was arrested while involved in another bank robbery, where another person lost their life. Witness statements helped link him to the previous triple homicide. In 2003, the Los Angeles court sentenced Adams to death for 3 counts of aggravated murder. Today, he remains on death row at San Quentin, where time crawls like the ticking of a clock counting down toward an execution without a set date. 15th, Joseph Naso. A murder list found in a journal. Women's names sharing matching initials like Roxine Rogesh and Carmen Colon. When police opened Joseph Naso's apartment in 2010, they found not just photos of victims but a detailed map of the mind from a man who once called himself a photographer. For nearly 20 years, Naso traveled across states with a camera and those names in his head. 4 women were restrained until they could no longer breathe. Left powerless, their bodies discarded along roadsides. He lived quietly, once working as a delivery driver. No one suspected a 77-year-old man of being a serial killer. In 2013, he was sentenced to death. When asked in court, Naso said, "I was just taking pictures." But no one forgets. His photos became the legacy of a nightmare. 16th, Cynthia, Lynn, Coffman. They were called a killer couple, but Cynthia Coffman always said, "I was his victim too." Alongside her boyfriend, James Marlow, she roamed across California in 1986. 4 women were kidnapped, tortured, and left on the roadside. Each case carried the same mark. Death was not the goal. It was the display of control. Cynthia claimed she was under psychological manipulation, but the physical evidence, from DNA, fingerprints, and survivor testimonies, showed her active role. In 1990, the court sentenced her to death. She remains one of the few women in California to face its harshest punishment. Coffman is now held at Chowchilla, where every locked door serves as a reminder that victims are not always the ones behind bars. 17th, James Gregory Marlow. No sound, No footprints left behind. But every step James Marlow took led to the bound body of another woman, discarded like refuse. Alongside Cynthia Coffman, Marlow moved from town to town. Each stop marked the disappearance of another life. Victims were often young women working alone. Easy to approach, easy to erase. In his journal he wrote, "Killing is how I get back at life." When arrested, he showed no panic. He only smiled. In 1990, both were sentenced to death. To many, Marlow was not just a killer. He was the embodiment of a dark storm where love and violence merged. In his cold, silent cell, he remains unchanged, just as he was from the day it all began. 18th. Michael Anthony Cox. 3 young women vanished in the same summer. Police found their bodies weeks later, scattered through the forests near Placerville. No signs of forced entry, no cameras, no witnesses. Michael Cox, once acquainted with one of the victims, was arrested based on a shifting witness statement and fragmented clues from the past. The trial ended quickly. The death sentence was handed down in 1985. Yet, decades later, questions remain. Was the testimony coerced? Was the evidence manipulated? Cox has never confessed. And within the walls of death row, he writes letters, each one insisting, "I am not the monster they want me to be." 19th. Kevin Cooper. A family of 4, including 2 young children, was found dead inside their home in Chino Hills. Police discovered their bodies covered in injuries, as if a storm of violence had raged through the night. Only one boy survived, carrying a faint memory of a black man. Kevin Cooper, an escapee from prison just days earlier, quickly became the prime suspect. Blood on his shirt, shoe prints in the house. Everything pointed to him. Yet, over the years, dozens of lawyers, journalists, even judges have argued that the evidence may have been planted. Cooper has always maintained his innocence. His death sentence from 1985 remains uncarried out, not only because of state moratoriums, but because this case remains one of the most bitterly divided in California's legal history. 20th. Stephen David Catlin. The deaths happened quietly. First his wife, then his stepmother, and finally his biological mother. All died of sudden heart failure. Doctors called it natural. But suspicions grew when tissue samples were tested. The same poison, paraquat. Stephen David Catlin, a polite man with an unsuspecting appearance, had been silently poisoning the 3 women closest to him. His motive? Insurance money. When arrested, Catlin denied everything, but his fingerprints on a chemical bottle in his garage became undeniable proof. In 1990, Catlin was sentenced to death. He is now held at Corcoran, an aging man once sharp enough to turn trust into a deadly weapon. 21st. Herbert James Coddington. 2 elderly women went missing after a gathering in Lake Tahoe. 2 days later, their bodies were found inside the home of a man who claimed to be a photographer, a man known for luring young girls with promises of modeling opportunities. Herbert Coddington not only killed the 2 older women, but also held and assaulted 2 underage girls. Police uncovered a fake studio where he documented every moment in a dark room. He offered no denial, only silence. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. In 2000, California Supreme Court upheld the verdict, a reminder that those who twist art into manipulation will not be spared. Coddington remains at San Quentin, surrounded by real darkness. 22nd. Run Peter Chhoun. Amid gang violence in California during the 1990s, one name struck fear even among hardened criminals: Run Chhoun. Unlike typical shootings, he orchestrated a series of 9 killings, including children and relatives of his enemies. In the quiet of night, gunfire echoed like warnings from a world where life held no value. It took police nearly a year to track Chhoun down, from matching weapons to testimonies from his own crew. At his 2002 trial, he showed no remorse, simply stating, "I did what needed to be done." With 9 lives taken, the death sentence was inevitable. Today, he remains at San Quentin, where each passing day serves as its own sentence, repeating without end. 23rd. Keith Edward Adcox. One morning in May 1982, campers in Tuolumne County found a man lifeless in the pine forest near a missing truck. The victim was David Orozco, shot in the chest at close range with a handgun. The killer, Keith Adcox, then just 20 years old, was accused of plotting to steal the truck and money, ending it all with a cold trigger pull. Police tracked Adcox through a survivor's testimony, someone who narrowly escaped that deadly forest. In 1983, Adcox was sentenced to death for special circumstances murder. Decades later, he remains on death row at San Quentin. 24th. Jason Alejandro Aguirre. When gunshots rang out in a Garden Grove neighborhood, people thought it was just fireworks. But a 13-year-old boy never got back up. Jason Aguirre, a gang member, believed the child belonged to a rival group and chose to punish him in the coldest way possible. A bullet to the chest. No warning. No second chance. The case shook the community, as the victim had no ties to any gang. The FBI and witnesses identified Aguirre within days. In 2009, Orange County sentenced him to death for the murder of a minor. Since then, Aguirre has remained at San Quentin. The prison walls are not high, but the memory of that single gunshot is something he cannot escape. 25th. Joseph Aguayo. On a spring night in 1979, the body of Eva Chu, a woman 7 months pregnant, was found in her own Sacramento apartment. No signs of forced entry. No bloodstains. Only a deadly silence. Nearly 2 decades later, DNA technology revealed the killer. Joseph Aguayo, once an acquaintance of the victim. When arrested, he was already serving time for other crimes. The old murder seemed buried until evidence tied him to Eva's death. In 1996, Aguayo was sentenced to death. Now in his 80s, he remains at San Quentin among men who have killed, and men still waiting to meet death in their own way. 26th. David Carpenter. Along the peaceful trails surrounding the San Francisco Bay, few knew that in the 1980s these paths were once the hunting ground of a serial killer. David Carpenter, known as the Trailside Killer, quietly approached women walking alone. He did not rob. He did not scream. He simply acted. Fast, decisive, leaving no chance of survival. At least 7 victims lost their lives to him. After his final killing, police found a gun, knives, and a detailed map of the trails inside Carpenter's car. In 1984 and 1988, he received 2 death sentences. Now in his 90s, David Carpenter is California's oldest death row inmate, though the cruelty he unleashed has never aged. 27th. Albert Greenwood Brown. One October afternoon in Riverside, California, a 15-year-old girl vanished on her way home from school. The search lasted only a few hours before ending in tragedy. Her body was found in a nearby forest, showing clear signs of assault and premeditated murder. Albert Greenwood Brown, previously convicted of sexual assault, was arrested soon after making an anonymous call to the victim's family. In court, he confessed, leaving the courtroom silent in outrage. Brown was sentenced to death in 1982, but decades of appeals have delayed his execution. He remains at San Quentin, a man who once called to report his own crime as if reading lines from a sick play. 28th. Joseph Martin Danks. While living homeless in Los Angeles, Joseph Danks called himself the Punisher of the Shadows. Over several weeks in 1987, he killed 6 homeless men, each attacked as they slept. When arrested, he laughed and said they belonged nowhere. But it did not end there. In 1990, already in prison, Danks killed his cellmate, a 67-year-old man awaiting release. This time, he offered no denial, only stating, "I like the final silence." A later trial sentenced him to death. Danks remains at San Quentin. 29th. Kerry Lyn Dalton. No body, no clear crime scene. Yet testimony from a so-called punishment inside a trailer home in Live Oak Springs led to Kerry Lyn Dalton's death sentence. She was accused, alongside accomplices, of killing Irene Louise with knives, frying pans, and even acid, over allegations of stolen heroin. Though a body was never found, disturbing witness statements left the jury without hesitation. In 1995, Dalton was sentenced to death. Nearly 30 years later, California's Supreme Court reviewed the case for lack of physical evidence, yet she remains on death row. In her cell, she still claims to be a victim of rumor and collective panic. 30th. Ramon Bojorquez Salcido. One April morning in 1989, in the wine country of Sonoma, California, a small house revealed a scene of horror. Women, children, blood staining the floors. Ramon Salcido, a winery worker, had unleashed a spree of violence. His mother-in-law, 2 nieces, his wife, and their 3 children. He used a knife, each cut bringing a deadly silence. Miraculously, his 3-year-old daughter survived, carrying scars on her neck for life. Salcido fled to Mexico, caught while drunk, still rambling about hatred. In 1990, he received the death penalty. At San Quentin, he waits behind silent walls, where the crimes of that day have never faded from Sonoma's memory. 31st. Kevin Bernard Haley. He called himself the Remorseless Predator. In the summer of 1984, Kevin Haley roamed Los Angeles, choosing elderly women who lived alone as his victims. Dolores Clement, 55, was assaulted and suffocated in her small apartment. Laverne Stolze, 56, was beaten to death with a wooden stick in her bedroom. Police traced Haley through fingerprints and DNA, arresting him soon after he casually bragged about crimes yet undiscovered. 2 death sentences, 1 delayed, 1 reinstated. But the outcome remained the same. Kevin Haley remains at San Quentin, a man who fears nothing, believing that a few more victims would never have changed his fate. 32nd. David Esco Welch. On a dark night in Oakland, 1986, David Moochie Welch entered his ex-girlfriend's home with a gun in hand. No one had time to react. 6 people died, from children to adults. 2 survivors carry their scars for life. The motive? A nameless rage. An evening searching for a lost dog turned massacre. Welch fled for less than 10 hours, caught with a self-inflicted gunshot wound from his escape. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. His crime remembered as Oakland's worst mass killing until the Oikos University tragedy decades later. At San Quentin, Welch remained silent. No explanation, no regret. 33rd. Mauricio Rodriguez Silva. They called him the Monster. In 1984, within just 9 days, Mauricio Rodriguez Silva killed 3 people with both gun and knife. A 16-year-old boy in the Mojave Desert, a 16-year-old girl near an airport, and finally his own sister after his family had just taken him in. When police arrived at the final scene, he was calmly wiping away blood. No arguing, no panic. DNA confirmed everything. In 1986, he was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, debates arose over whether a Latino jury had the right to decide his fate, but the sentence remained. At San Quentin, Silva stands as a quiet shadow of darkness, a man who killed for control, for thrill, because humanity never existed within him. 34th. Jeffrey Aguilar. Oxnard, August 2008, an ordinary morning. But outside a bank, a gunshot ended the life of Gurmahinder Singh, a 55-year-old man who had just withdrawn $100,000 for his store. Jeffrey Aguilar was waiting, pulled the trigger without hesitation, took the money, and fled. Days later, he fired at police during another robbery, then hid in a motel in Carpinteria. When arrested, he mocked them, claiming he felt no regret. In 2013, he was sentenced to death. Those in the courtroom never forgot his scornful glance, a look that showed how, for some people, a life is worth less than a handful of dirty bills. 35th. Regis Dion Thomas. On a January night in 1993, 2 patrol officers in Compton never made it home. As they approached a suspicious vehicle, Regis Thomas stepped out, drew his gun, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. 2 shots. 2 officers dead on the spot. Thomas was a member of the Bloods gang, already carrying a murder conviction from 1992. When arrested, he said nothing, only stared blankly into the camera. In court, his defense pointed to a troubled childhood, but the jury refused to accept it. 2 death sentences were handed down. This case sparked public outrage for its sheer brutality, committed without cause. He was sent straight to San Quentin, confined to the isolated unit reserved for those with no path back. Regis Dion, Thomas, remains alive, but every door before him has been closed forever. 37th, Andre Alexander. Julie Cross, the first female agent for the Secret Service's Anti-Counterfeiting Division, was killed during a surveillance operation in 1980. The man who pulled the trigger was Andre Alexander, already convicted for murder within a counterfeit ring. He evaded capture for nearly 12 years until LAPD arrested him in 1992. The investigation revealed more. Alexander had killed 2 others to silence them. A series of crimes ended with a death sentence in 1996. In court, he only shook his head and said, "She was in the wrong job, at the wrong place, at the wrong time." At San Quentin, Alexander remains a reminder that not everyone in a black suit ends with glory. 38th, Alberto Alvarez. A police officer fell in broad daylight from a single gunshot in what began as a petty argument. Alberto Alvarez, a former convict with a history of violence, pulled the trigger and killed Officer Richard Rick May in San Mateo in 2006. When arrested, he simply said, "I didn't want to go back to prison." But that excuse couldn't save a life. In 2010, the court sentenced him to death. 1 bullet, 1 life, 1 death sentence no one pitied. As he left the courtroom, Alvarez bowed his head, not from remorse, but because there was nothing left to say. He now remains at San Quentin, a place he chose the moment he pulled the trigger. 39th. Roman Gabriel Aldana. A 16-year-old girl who had run away after a family argument could never have imagined her life would end inside an abandoned apartment in Riverside. Lured to what was promised as a party, she endured relentless physical and psychological abuse until survival was no longer possible. In the end, her body was left in a bathtub. The house was set on fire, as if to erase every trace. The ringleader, Roman Aldana, just 18 years old, the one who directed every gruesome act. The jury did not take long to deliver a death sentence. He remains on death row at San Quentin, where each passing day only deepens one question: how could someone so young harbor such cruelty within? 40th. Samuel Amador. One night in August 2004 in South San Bernardino, screams echoed from a small home. When police arrived, Michael Wilson and Pedro Rios were already dead. The scene bore clear signs of extreme violence. The killer was Samuel Amador, a man with a criminal past, driven this time by revenge and money. He used both knife and gun, leaving no one a chance to survive. Investigators quickly traced him through an accomplice who detailed every step Amador had taken. But his record was even darker. More than 20 years earlier, Amador had been linked to the brutal Ryan family attack, which left an 8-year-old child gravely wounded. In 2022, the court sentenced him to death. At San Quentin, Samuel Amador says nothing more. For in the darkness of his cell, he knows. His ending was written long ago,